It seemed like just another ordinary afternoon for Ben Harper. His work maintaining office equipment usually kept him busy enough to push aside daily worries. But that day was different. He finished earlier than usual, and on his way home, an idea suddenly struck him. Why not surprise his wife, Lauren, with a romantic dinner? After 7 years of marriage, their relationship had started to feel a bit stale. The spark that once burned brightly seemed to have faded. But Ben believed that perhaps a small gesture could reignite the flame. He decided to take a chance and drove to Outback, Lauren's favorite restaurant. Just a few weeks ago, she had mentioned having lunch there with her friends. It was a random thought, but Ben couldn't ignore it. As he pulled into the restaurant's bustling parking lot, his heart skipped a beat. Right in front of him was Lauren's car, unmistakable and parked neatly. A wave of unease swept over him. Maybe it's just a coincidence, he told himself, trying to stay calm. For a moment, he thought about going inside, wrapping his arms around Lauren, and watching the surprise and delight light up her face. But something held him back. A strange feeling, like a quiet whisper in the back of his mind, told him to wait. Minutes ticked by until the restaurant door opened. Lauren stepped out, a radiant smile on her face. But she wasn't alone. Walking beside her was a tall, well-dressed man with neatly styled brown hair. The sight before him felt like a punch to the gut, leaving Ben frozen in his seat. They looked so at ease together, their laughter blending seamlessly as they strolled toward Lauren's car. Ben's hands tightened around the steering wheel, his knuckles white as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. The man beside her wasn't a stranger. It was Andrew Miller, her ex-boyfriend from college. Lauren had mentioned Andrew before, always in passing, as if he were nothing more than a faded memory. But what Ben saw now shattered that illusion. The connection between them wasn't distant. It was alive, pulsing with familiarity. Ben's chest felt heavy, his breath uneven as he watched their every move. They stood close, their smiles wide, their gestures almost perfectly synchronized. He wanted to dismiss it, to tell himself it was just a friendly meeting. But doubt clung to him, sharp and unrelenting. When Lauren and Andrew got into her car, Ben's heart sank. A wave of unease washed over him, drowning out reason. Without thinking, he started his own car and followed them. The drive stretched on, each passing mile amplifying the tension in his chest. Finally, Lauren's car pulled into a driveway in a quiet, secluded neighborhood. Ben parked at a distance, his pulse quickening as he watched them step out of the car. Lauren seemed relaxed, even animated, as she and Andrew spoke outside the house. They shared a moment that felt intimate, their words flowing effortlessly. Then, together, they walked into the house. Ben remained frozen, his world unraveling as he sat in his car, paralyzed by betrayal. His gaze locked on Lauren's car, and that's when he saw it, the final blow. Through the window, he caught a glimpse of her opening the console. She removed her earrings, delicate and familiar, followed by her wedding ring. She placed them inside, as if discarding a meaningless trinket. The simple act felt like a knife to Ben's heart. His mind reeled, a maelstrom of disbelief and pain. The ground beneath him seemed to collapse, leaving him suspended in a void. The image of Lauren taking off her ring burned into his memory. A cruel symbol of everything he feared was true. It wasn't just a betrayal of trust. It was a rejection of everything they'd built together. He drove home in silence, though his thoughts were anything but quiet. Every turn of the wheel felt automatic, every breath an effort. When he pulled into the garage and stepped into the house, the walls that once held warmth and comfort now felt suffocating. Cold, Ben sank onto the couch, staring blankly at the wedding ring and earrings he'd retrieved from Lauren's car. They lay in his hand like fragments of a life he no longer recognized. He stared at them, not as symbols of love, but as pieces of a truth he didn't want to accept. Ben wasn't the impulsive type, but something inside him snapped. He decided he needed clarity and, above all, dignity. He went upstairs to the bedroom, grabbed a suitcase, and began filling it with his clothes and essential belongings. Each item placed inside was like a Small farewell to the life he thought he had. Then he emptied the joint account he had with Lauren, transferring the funds to an account in his name only. He knew she wouldn't need the money as much as he needed distance. When the clock struck 7 p.m., he heard the sound of Lauren's car pulling into the driveway. Ben took a deep breath and prepared for the confrontation. It wouldn't be a spectacular. He wasn't the type to raise his voice or make a scene, but she needed to hear what he had to say. The door opened, and Lauren entered with a smile that vanished instantly upon seeing him sitting on the couch, holding her ring and earrings. The air felt heavier than ever. She dropped her purse on the floor and hesitated for a moment before trying to appear casual. "Hi, honey, you're home early. How was your day?" she said, her voice slightly trembling. Ben didn't respond right away. He just looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of hurt and determination. After an uncomfortable moment, he held up the ring between his fingers. "Lauren, where's your ring?" The question was direct, almost surgical. She blinked, seemingly trying to buy time to think. "Oh, I think I took it off this morning before I left. Maybe I left it in the bathroom. You know how forgetful I am with these things." Ben tilted his head slightly, as if considering her excuse. Then, calmly, he replied, "Left it in the bathroom." "Huh." He stood up slowly, his movements controlled, like someone handling a dangerous animal. "Or was it in the console of your car, in front of Andrew's house? Because that's where I found this." The impact of his words was immediate. Lauren's face lost all color, and her eyes widened. She tried to speak, but no sound came out. After a few suffocating seconds of silence, she finally murmured, Where did you find that?" "Ben, it's not what you think," he interrupted firmly, without raising his voice. But each word was sharp. "I saw you, Lauren. I saw you having lunch with him. I saw you entering his house. I saw you taking this off as if it meant nothing." He held the ring for a moment before gently tossing it onto the table between them. "You don't need to explain. I get it." Lauren took a step toward him, her face now a mix of desperation and panic. "Ben, please. It was just a casual meeting. Nothing happened. I swear. I was going to tell you, but I didn't know how." He raised his hand to stop her. "It doesn't matter. Lauren, whatever you did or didn't do, it's enough." He picked up the suitcase that was beside the couch and started walking toward the door. "I'm leaving. I'm going to take a few days to think. And when I come back, it'll be with divorce papers." Lauren stood there, motionless, as Ben walked out the door. The sound of the suitcase rolling across the floor echoed through the room. He didn't look back. He closed the door calmly and got into the car. The engine roared in the quiet of the night, and he was gone, leaving behind not just a house but an entire chapter of the life he thought he'd built with Lauren. Ben drove aimlessly that night, the illuminated city passing by as a blur outside the window. Each mile seemed to take away a piece of the weight he carried, but also left a deep void. The road, with its constant hum, became his only companion as he tried to sort out his thoughts. His phone rang incessantly, but he didn't look. He knew it was Lauren, and at that moment, nothing she could say could erase what he had seen. When the sun began to rise, he realized he was on the interstate heading toward Columbus, Ohio, where his older brother Thomas lived. He was the only person he trusted now. Thomas had always been practical and straightforward, the kind of man who told things as they were, without sugarcoating. Ben knew he needed that objectivity. Driving there seemed like the only logical decision at that moment. Upon arriving, Ben parked in the driveway of Thomas's modest house, a place he hadn't visited in years. The house had the same cozy appearance as always, but Ben felt like a stranger in his own life. He knocked on the door, and Thomas answered with the confused expression of someone not expecting visitors so early. "Ben, man, what are you doing here at this hour? Everything okay?" The simple question made Ben let out a bitter laugh. He entered without saying anything and flopped onto the living room sofa. The look he gave Thomas was enough to explain that okay was the last thing he was. Thomas brought 2 beers and sat down across from him. "All right, spill it." What happened? Ben didn't hold back. For the first time since he'd left home, he poured out everything he'd been bottling up. He talked about Lauren, about Andrew, about the rings in the car console, about the confrontation. Each detail was a mix of anger, sadness, and frustration. Thomas listened without interrupting, but the tightness in his jaw showed how much he was holding back his own emotions. When Ben finished, Thomas took a deep breath. Well, brother, you did what you had to do. You were direct, left no room for excuses. But now what? What's the plan? That was the question Ben didn't want to face. He knew he couldn't just hide out at Thomas's place forever. But he also didn't have the strength to go back home and face the emptiness Lauren had left. I don't know, he replied, looking at the beer in his hand. I just know I need to change. I can't go back to living like before. Thomas took a sip of his beer and nodded slowly. Well, then you need to find something new, something that gives you a reason to move forward. Thomas's words stayed with Ben in the following days. He stayed at his brother's house for a week, trying to recover emotionally. During that time, he avoided any contact with Lauren. He blocked her calls, ignored her messages, and even turned off email notifications. It was painful but necessary. It was during one of those nights, while watching a documentary on TV with Thomas, that Ben had an idea. The program showcased the lives of truck drivers and how they traveled across the country, dealing with the challenges of the road. There was something about the freedom in those stories that caught his attention. I think I want to try that, he said suddenly. Thomas looked at him, puzzled. Try what? Being a truck driver. Being on the road. Away from everything. Away from her. Thomas tilted his head, considering the idea. Well, that's quite a change. But if that's what you want, why not? Ben began researching certification courses that same week. He needed something to get him out of inertia, to make him feel like he was regaining control of his own life. And the open road seemed like the perfect place to start. After intense weeks of training and certification, Ben Harper finally got his license to drive freight trucks. The feeling of accomplishment was an unexpected relief, a small ray of light amid the shadows that had taken over his life. He found himself in a whole new world, made of endless roads, static-filled radios, and stops at gas stations that always seemed the same but never were. With each mile traveled, Ben felt he was leaving behind pieces of the man he used to be. On one of his first long trips, an interstate route that would take him from Illinois to Colorado, Ben stopped at a large gas station as night fell. The place was bustling, like a small ecosystem of truckers, tourists, and weary drivers seeking coffee and rest. He parked the truck in one of the bays and went into the convenience store to buy something to eat. As he walked, something caught his attention. Woman, apparently alone, standing next to a car with the hood open. She seemed to be in trouble. From a distance, Ben noticed her frustrated expression as she fiddled uselessly with the engine. He hesitated for a moment. He didn't want to get involved in problems, but he also couldn't ignore someone who needed help. He decided to approach. Need a hand? He asked, his voice low and calm. The woman looked up, surprised but relieved. She had brown hair pulled back in a messy bun and wore a jacket that seemed a bit too big for her slender frame. Oh, yes, please, she replied. I was on my way to Kansas City, and the car just died. I have no idea what happened. Ben leaned over the engine, examining the problem. Though not a mechanic, he knew enough to realize the car needed more than a quick fix. He tried to start the engine but got no response. Looks like the battery is completely dead, he said, wiping his hands on a rag he found on the car seat. I think you'll need a tow, she sighed, crossing her arms. Just what I needed right now, she said with a nervous laugh. Well, my name is Victoria. Victoria Langston. And you are? Ben Harper, he replied. Listen, I have a bit of time before I hit the road again. If you want, I can take you to the station to rest while you call for a tow. She hesitated but eventually agreed. During the short drive to the station, Victoria mentioned she was traveling without a fixed destination, trying to leave behind a bunch of problems, as she vaguely put it. Ben didn't press for details. He knew what it was like to want to escape the past. At the station, they talked for hours while waiting for assistance. Victoria was a good listener and had an easygoing way of talking that made Ben feel comfortable, something he hadn't felt in months. Eventually, the tow truck arrived, but Victoria seemed reluctant to say goodbye. Look, I don't know what you think about this, but could I tag along with you to Kansas City? She asked. I promise I won't be a bother. I just don't want to be stuck here. Ben was surprised by the request, but after a moment's thought, agreed. The loneliness of the road was starting to weigh on him, and the company didn't seem like a bad idea. Besides, Victoria seemed honest, if a bit mysterious. In the following days, her presence brought a lightness he didn't expect. They talked about everything and nothing, laughing at silly jokes and sharing life stories. However, there was something peculiar about Victoria that Ben couldn't ignore. Whenever Ohio was mentioned, even casually, like routes or Ben's memories, she would steer the conversation away or change the subject. It was as if that state, in particular, was forbidden territory for her. Ben decided not to push. After all, he had his own secrets too. The days with Victoria on board brought Ben a strange comfort, but also a slight unease. It was as if, while she seemed to brighten the hours on the road, a shadow followed her, something she never fully revealed. Her peculiar avoidance of Ohio became more evident over time. Every time the word came up, even in trivial contexts like routes or Ben's recollections, Victoria would immediately change the focus. He noticed but preferred not to press the issue. It was one particularly quiet night, at a rest stop in Kansas, that Ben began to notice other details. Victoria had a habit of carrying a small black bag that she never let out of her sight. Even during stops, she kept it close, as if it contained something valuable or perhaps dangerous. He found it odd, but again ignored it. After all, everyone carries secrets, right? During that stop, Ben was refueling the truck when he overheard a conversation between two truckers in the parking lot. The talk seemed heated, but what caught his attention was the tone of alarm in their whispers. It's the same story. Man, another trucker found dead, one of the men said, gesturing with the hand holding a coffee cup, and the police still think it was poisoning. It's getting dangerous out here. Ben tried not to show he was listening, but the words trucker and poisoning made him freeze for a moment. He wasn't usually paranoid, but the idea of something like that happening on the road made him uneasy. He returned to the truck with a slight knot in his stomach but disguised it, not wanting to alarm Victoria. Climbing into the cab, he found her calm, looking at the road as if she were at peace. There was something almost hypnotic about how she seemed so detached from the world's chaos. Ben hesitated but decided to share what he'd heard. Hey, I overheard some guys talking at the station. Sounds like there was another case of a trucker killed by poisoning. Strange. Huh? Victoria turned her head to him, her face expressionless for a moment. Then a nervous smile appeared. That's scary, but you know how it is. People love to exaggerate. There's always gossip like that, especially in isolated places. Something about her response didn't feel right. Ben tried to dismiss his intuition. But that night, as he drove down the deserted road, thoughts began to pile up. He remembered the vials Victoria always carried in her bag and the time she'd handle them discreetly, saying they were just medicine. He also recalled how evasive she was when asked about her past. Doubt began to grow, a constant whisper in his mind. Victoria was kind, funny, and smart. But who was she really? And, above all, what was she hiding? While the radio played a soft song and Victoria seemed to doze off in the seat beside him, Ben glanced at her. The tranquility on her face contrasted with the unease now consuming him. The road ahead was long and lonely, but for the first time, Ben felt that maybe, just maybe, he was carrying something heavier than the cargo in the truck. The tension between Ben's doubts and Victoria's seemingly innocent behavior became unbearable on the next leg of their journey. They had crossed Missouri and were about to enter Ohio when Victoria, who usually seemed relaxed, began to show clear signs of restlessness. She tapped her fingers on the dashboard, constantly checked her phone, and with each sign indicating they were nearing the state. She'd avert her eyes as if fleeing something invisible. Ben noticed her discomfort, but waited for the right moment to ask. When they stopped at a rest area to refuel and stretch their legs, he finally broke the silence. "Is there a problem with Ohio?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Victoria froze for a moment, but then forced a smile. "No, nothing. Just lots of memories. I'd rather avoid it." Ben felt there was more to it. It wasn't just the discomfort of old memories. It was something deeper, almost like fear, but he didn't push. At that moment, he preferred to observe. However, with each mile closer to Ohio, the pieces he'd been gathering throughout the trip began to connect. That very night, at a gas station on the border between Indiana and Ohio, the peaceful setting was interrupted by the blare of sirens. Ben was in the truck, resting while Victoria was inside the convenience store. He saw two state police cruisers pull in abruptly, and shortly after, two officers got out and entered the store with determined postures. Moments later, one of the officers came out, holding something, a photo. He checked the face of everyone around and finally approached Ben's truck, knocking on the door and asking him to step out. "Are you Ben Harper?" the officer asked directly. "Yes, sir." "Is there a problem?" The officer studied him for a moment before showing the photo. It was of Victoria. The image seemed old, but was unmistakably her. "Are you traveling with this woman?" Ben hesitated for a second. He didn't want to get Victoria in trouble without knowing what was going on. But something in the officer's tone made his stomach churn. "Yes, I am." "Why?" The other officer, who had been silent until then, stepped in. "Mr. Harper, we need you to tell us everything about your interaction with her. This woman is a suspect in a series of trucker murders. We believe she may be poisoning her victims." The words hit Ben like a punch to the gut. His mind raced back to the vials she always carried, the vaguely told stories, her evasive behavior about Ohio. He tried to process what he was hearing as the officer continued. "We already have enough evidence to believe she's connected to at least 3 deaths. We think she uses gas stations and rest areas to choose her victims." At that moment, Ben felt as if the air around him had disappeared. Before he could respond, Victoria exited the store, carrying a bag of groceries. She immediately froze upon seeing the officers next to Ben, her eyes wide. For a second, they locked eyes. No words were exchanged, but something in Victoria's look seemed like a goodbye. Without warning, she dropped the bag and ran toward the back of the station. The officers reacted immediately, shouting orders for her to stop. Ben stood there, frozen, unable to decide whether to follow her or let her go. He no longer knew what was true and what was a lie. The officers chased after her, but Victoria vanished into the darkness. The sound of sirens echoed for a while until calm returned to the station. Ben was left alone, still in shock over what had just happened. Back in the truck, he opened the glove compartment looking for a document and found something he hadn't noticed before, a small vial. It was identical to the ones Victoria carried. He held it, feeling the weight of the discovery. The label had words he didn't understand, but enough to confirm his worst fears. It wasn't something harmless. That night, sitting in the truck seat with the vial in his hands, Ben felt betrayed, confused, and scared. Everything he thought he knew about Victoria had crumbled. Worse, he realized his own life had been at risk all along. The night Victoria fled left Ben with a whirlwind of thoughts he couldn't organize. He wasn't sure if he was more shocked by the revelation or by having ignored the signs that now seemed so clear. The vial found in the glove compartment was the final piece of a puzzle he never wanted to assemble, but there was no avoiding it now. Victoria wasn't who he believed, and the road they traveled together was shrouded in shadows Ben hadn't noticed in time. The next day, Ben was called to a nearby police station to give his statement. Sitting in a cold room with gray walls, he answered questions about his journey with Victoria. The officers were methodical but direct, and every detail Ben provided seemed to take them deeper into the investigation. "Do you recall any strange behavior?" Anything she said or did that seemed suspicious? One of the detectives asked. A middle-aged man with tired eyes. Ben hesitated, mentally replaying the moments he'd shared with Victoria. The bag she always guarded so carefully. The abrupt changes of subject when Ohio was mentioned. The way she always avoided getting close to other people at rest stops. She had vials, he finally said. She always carried them with her. So they were medicine, but never explained exactly what for. I didn't ask more because, well, I thought it wasn't my business. The detective made a note and looked at him. Those vials could be important. We've been able to trace other cases where victims ingested similar substances before dying. It's likely she's using these vials to mix something lethal. Ben swallowed hard. The thought that he could have been one of those victims made him shudder. He began to question everything. Why had Victoria approached him? Was he just another target? Or was there something more? The following days were filled with unease. Ben returned to the road. But now the solitude that once was a refuge felt oppressive. He turned on the radio, trying to drown out his thoughts. But the news about Victoria was everywhere. Authorities confirmed she'd been seen in Ohio, the very place she seemed so determined to avoid. The revelation left him unsettled. Why would Victoria return to the state she feared so much? What was she hiding? Back in the truck, Ben began to retrace events. He realized something he'd previously overlooked during their conversations. Victoria had mentioned, almost casually, a name he hadn't connected to anything. It was the name of a trucker she said she'd met years ago. But now, after searching online, Ben discovered that name was connected to one of the earliest poisoning cases. The coincidence was too significant to ignore. Ben knew he couldn't just keep driving and pretend nothing had happened. He was involved in something much bigger than he imagined. With a heavy mind and racing heart, he decided he needed to face the truth. Not just about Victoria, but about himself and the choices that had led him here. The road was long, but this time, it wasn't just a physical destination awaiting him. It was an inevitable conclusion, a confrontation with secrets that had remained buried for too long. The news that Victoria had been arrested reached Ben while he was taking a break at a small roadside diner. He was sipping coffee and reading the local paper when he saw the headline. Woman suspected of killing truckers arrested in Ohio. It was her, without a doubt. The photo showed Victoria with a serene, almost indifferent look that made Ben shiver. He knew he needed closure. He needed to understand what lay behind everything they'd experienced together on the road. Ben drove to the penitentiary where Victoria was being held. He didn't know exactly what he expected to find, but something inside him demanded answers. Upon arrival, he was led to a visitation room, separated by a thick pane of glass. When Victoria entered, wearing the orange prison uniform, she looked like a different person. There was something empty in her eyes, as if all the energy he knew had vanished. He picked up the phone, connecting them, and got straight to the point. Why? He asked, his voice heavy with conflicting emotions. Why did you do all this? Victoria, she held the phone on the other side, sighed, and looked at him with a mix of weariness and relief, as if she'd been expecting this question. You want to know the truth? Ben, she began, her voice low but firm. I was married twice. My first husband was a trucker. At first, he seemed perfect. But do you know what he did on every trip? Cheated. Every damn trip was an excuse to be with another woman. I found the messages, motel receipts, everything. I felt destroyed, but managed to divorce him. Thought I could start over. She paused, looking down before continuing. Then I met another trucker. Thought he'd be different. He seemed caring, attentive, but he was worse. The cheating was blatant, and he didn't bother hiding it. I endured it for years. Every mile he drove was another piece of me he destroyed. Ben listened in silence, feeling her anger overflow even through the glass. That's when something broke inside me, Victoria said, her expression cold. I realized that to them, it was just that, a life of trips and betrayals. I started to hate, not just them, but all of them. Every trucker I saw, every man who reminded me of them. I decided they didn't deserve to keep doing what they did to me. They needed to pay. She looked at Ben firmly, as if waiting for his reaction. But he couldn't speak for a long time. His hands gripped the phone tightly, and he felt a knot in his stomach. It was sickening, but at the same time, he saw the pain that had led Victoria to that point. It didn't justify her actions, but it explained them. Finally, he spoke. And me? Did you plan to do the same to me? Victoria gave a slight smile, but it wasn't one of joy. It was sad, almost resigned. No, you were different, but deep down, I knew it wouldn't last. Maybe one day you would have cheated on me too, and I would have done the same to you. Ben remained silent, absorbing her words. Her coldness was disconcerting, but also forced him to look within himself. He thought about the day he saw Lauren entering Andrew's house. The anger he felt at that moment, the impulse to storm into the house and do something terrible. If he'd given in to that rage, he might have followed a path similar to Victoria's, destroying his life forever. He took a deep breath, put down the phone, and looked at her one last time. Thank you for telling me. I hope you find peace somehow. Without waiting for a response, Ben stood up and left the room, feeling an enormous weight lifted from his shoulders. He knew he couldn't carry Victoria's choices. The only thing he could do was move forward, back on the road. Something had changed in Ben. He was more attentive to the people around him, more aware of the shadows everyone carries. But above all, he felt lighter. His experience with Victoria, as frightening as it was, had taught him something important. Unresolved emotions can turn into monsters if you let them. Now, he drove with more purpose, more at peace with himself. The road remained the same, long and challenging, but Ben finally felt ready to face it, 1 mile at a time. Thank you for watching the video.